Osio, Ayakui, Necknow Taylor Thompson. Hello, my name is Taylor Thompson, and I'm the Food Sovereignty Division Manager for the Yurok tribe. The Food Sovereignty Division is housed within our environmental program. And a little bit about me. I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I use they, them pronouns. I have a background in biology and in environmental studies. And I'm currently residing on Wiyot ancestral territory, and grateful to be working with the Yurok tribe and working towards re-achieving total food sovereignty. So the first thing I wanted to discuss is the concept of food sovereignty itself. I'm sure the word has been bounced around for a while in many communities, but it's not a new concept to Yurok people by any stretch of the imagination. So even though our food sovereignty division has only been around for a little over a year now, it's a concept that's existed within Yurok communities since time immemorial. Before the arrival of European Americans and the effects of colonization and genocide, the Yurok people were able to sustain themselves fully and completely and in balance with the environment through their ancestral territory. Since a lot of the access and management of the Yurok ancestral territory is limited and outside of reservation boundaries, that isn't quite the current state of affairs. So what the Food Sovereignty Division is hoping to do is to work towards achieving total food sovereignty for the Yurok tribe again. And what we mean by food sovereignty is meeting the nutritional, caloric, and cultural needs through food that's gathered, grown, hunted, or otherwise procured within Yurok ancestral territory. The need for the Food Sovereignty Division itself to be like a formal government entity, so to speak, has kind of come about from input from several different entities. So the first, and probably I would argue the most important place where we heard that this program needed to be formalized was actually from community and tribal member input. Community members were acknowledging that there needs to be increased food security and access to traditional foods within the reservation and ancestral territory. There's also been some formal research that's been done in partnership with UC Berkeley, as well as many other institutions, and the USDA, and our own ongoing surveys and studies that have demonstrated that there is a great need for increased food security, access to traditional foods, and some of the other programs that we're hoping to implement. And so these two primary sources have been brought together to the Yurok Tribal Council and were formally proposed by the environmental director, Louisa McCovey. And was just like, what do we need to do to formalize this? How can we create a home for all of these great ideas and projects that are already working towards total food sovereignty in a way that we can make sure that they're all working together collaboratively, and getting the most mileage out of these programs. Yurok Tribal Council has been in full support of that since the very beginning, and they've been super helpful with helping with the planning and oversight of our programs and projects, and providing support however they can. So I kind of mentioned already what the overarching goal of the Food Sovereignty Division is, in order to meet all of the cultural, nutritional, and caloric needs for Yurok people. But some of our sub goals that kind of would lead towards that are establishing food production spaces, at least initially within the Yurok reservation, but then also able to extend outside of that. Accompanying educational opportunities for schools on the reservation and surrounding areas, as well as for community members. We want to not only for the Yurok tribe to be food sovereign as a tribe, but we want it to get down to the household level. We want individual households to be food sovereign. And a huge part of that will be through education. And supporting, tribal member food production. another component of that, the household level sovereignty, and a huge component of the lack of current household food sovereignty is actually due to financial restrictions. So what we would like to do is create farmers markets and other economic opportunities for Yurok tribal members to be able to capitalize on, so to speak, in order to increase their financial security in addition to food security in working towards food sovereignty. So we think that those overlapping programs will be really helpful. And a key component of working towards food sovereignty is actually traditional land management. And you'll hear a little bit about this from people that know way more about it than I will. But a key component will be implementing traditional and cultural burns on the ancestral territory in order to help encourage traditional food production. So we're hoping to kind of support those ongoing efforts. So diving in a little bit more into what the actual components of a sovereign food system are, and what we're hoping to do, is really leaning into supporting traditional food systems like I just briefly touched on. So this is a vast oversimplification, but the three broad categories that I've kind of broken up the traditional foods into are forest, rivers, and then ocean and coast. So the forest landscapes is what I was mentioning before, that will really need some help with getting traditional and cultural burns back on the ground. They've been outlawed for a very long time, despite the species here kind of co-evolving with that. So we really want to lean into helping support those programs in order to help strengthen the existing food systems that are there, like the tan oak acorn, tan oak mushrooms, huckleberry, hazelnut, and the dozens and dozens and dozens of others. For our river ecosystems, if you know anything about Yurok people, you know that they are a salmon people. So in addition to salmon, there's also lamprey eel and many other fish that rely on the Klamath River, as well as its tributaries and the attaching streams and other watersheds. These fish are critical protein sources and are so important on a cultural and nutritional level. And they face many threats, many of which stem from hydroelectric dams and global climate change and over allocation of water upstream. I could go on and on. But so there's quite a few environmental threats to our river ecosystems as well. Similarly, ocean and coast ecosystems that provide many foods like seaweed, mussel, crab, and other shellfish are also limited access right now. Whether that's lack of co-management or over-harvesting or just they're not being allowed for there to be an actual harvest. Are kind of some issues that we've been facing that we have on our radar that we want to help support. For actual for food production to kind of help support traditional food systems, we're hoping to plant and care for gardens and orchards within the Yurok reservation. Particularly since we don't have access to all of Yurok ancestral territory, it would make it very difficult to have access to sufficient traditional foods to support everyone's needs. So we're hoping to plant and support the heritage orchard trees that already exist, for both fruits and nuts, and incorporating as many native species as possible into that, whether that's a local hazelnut tree or whatnot. Similarly, we're also planning on planting vegetable gardens. I hesitate to call them farms because I think where our approach is going to be so vastly different from what most people think of a farm as, that we've been calling them gardens more for the time being. But our main barrier there is actually identifying safe and year-round water sources, because global climate change is changing our rainfall patterns, and lack of water access is causing some issues. So there's some troubleshooting that we're doing, but I think we're off to a good start, and I'm excited to kind of see how things go from here. And we also want to incorporate culturally relevant species such as medicines, basket-making materials, and regalia materials into these garden orchard spaces in order to have them be very accessible to community members as much as possible. So one component, I'd say maybe our primary focus at the moment, program-wise, to kind of support all these, is creating what we're calling Yurok food villages. So we're hoping to implement these food villages within the reservation, kind of 3 target areas for the time being. One in the coastal part of the reservation in the Klamath-Orequa area, another at the most inland portion of the reservation, which is at Witchbeck or Tule Creek area, and then a third kind of in the center of the reservation in Watek, Shrigon area. So these will kind of make it as accessible as possible for as many of the people that live within the reservation as possible, which is very remote and doesn't have a great connectivity from one end to the other. But we think after these 3 spaces that there's potential expansion to additional locations outside the reservation throughout Yurok ancestral territory. I won't go through this slide in its entirety because we don't have the time, but we have identified these key focuses for the Yurok food villages. But the highlights that I really wanted to bring up really quick are our regenerative agricultural practices that we're trying to implement. Will really closely tie in cultural connectivity of being stewards of the land. We don't want to come in and plant a bunch of things that are harmful for the environment or have to implement these practices that harm the world. We want to make sure that we're having a reciprocal, mutually beneficial relationship with the environment. And it's going to take a lot of community involvement, interdepartmental coordination, and whatnot to make that happen. And we think there's a strong opportunity to bring both in knowledges from traditional Yurok knowledge, as well as scientific methodology, in order to have a system that will meet the needs of the tribe. So the Yurok food villages, kind of to help visualize what they'll look like and what they'll contain, is we want that cultural connectivity piece to be into the very brick and mortar of the building itself. So the photo that I have up here is of the Yurok Visitor Center that's in Klamath right now. And it's modeled very closely off of traditional Yurok houses. So we're hoping to implement a similar building design for the food villages, as well as topping that beautiful looking roof with solar panels and having water catchment systems and making it carbon neutral and zero waste as much as possible, and just trying to make it as regenerative as we can, but while having that strong cultural connectivity piece. For the components of the food village itself, we already kind of touched on the orchards and gardens that we want to have, as well as greenhouses. But we also want these buildings to have indoor and outdoor education spaces in order to provide the educational opportunities that we had talked about, both for students and for community members. And we also want there to be commercial kitchens and food processing equipment and cold storage and seed banks and all the things that we need for short-term and long-term disaster resiliency, because that's a huge component of food sovereignty as well. It's not just are we growing enough to feed somebody or everybody for this upcoming season, but it's also if there's another pandemic, can we feed our community? So we want to make sure that we have that resiliency piece built in. For the food production space itself, I know I've already mentioned that we want to support existing traditional food systems as much as possible, which are literally a food forest. But for our orchard and garden spaces that we're hoping to cultivate, we want to use a food forest model there as well, because that's just seems like the approach that is closely imitates nature as much as possible and supports the regenerative agriculture practices that we want to implement. Some of the programmatic ideas, I won't really spend much time going through them, but we really want to provide the opportunity for intergenerational traditional knowledge sharing and moving forward with household food sovereignty as well as tribal food. I have my contact information listed here, as well as Louisa McCovey, the environmental director, and all of the artwork and photos that you've been seeing in the background of these of this PowerPoint are all done by her. So I just wanted to give her a nice little shout out there for providing that. But we'll definitely be excited to hear everyone's question. And just wanted to say waklao and thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to listening into the rest of the symposium.